we had a boat and on the south shore of Long Island, and uh, Billy was friendly enough with Barbara, my sister, and me, and so we would occasionally have him out on the boat on the weekends, and he would come out, and he was just a really, really nice young man. We really enjoyed doing things together. And as we started going into junior high school and then into high school, things started to change a bit. But Billy and Barbara and I remained friends. Barbara and Judy, his older sister, were good friends. And so we entertained them, we did things with them. And it probably was in high school, in the mid-60s, that we, Billy Billy and his sister did not have a television set. And we had a television set, and we invited Billy over to watch the Ed Sullivan Show for the first Beatles show on the Ed Sullivan Show. And Billy watched the show, and having been a musician for a number of years, he had been in the Fork Lane Elementary School band, he was in the junior high school band, he was in the Hicksville High School band. And there was a spark that night. It was a Sunday night, I remember it very clearly. And he watched the Beatles, and he was just enthralled and totally deep into watching them. And it was, I mean, Barbara and I loved what we were hearing, and it was great. But there was something special with Billy, there was a connection there that was very special. And it was that night that he later told me it was that night that made him want to be a rock and roll singer. And so that was the beginning. At that time, soon after that, Billy was starting to get into, he was separating from the rest of the neighborhood. We were all kind of, real straight kids. And Billy started to get into gangs, and they would actually have these scheduled rumbles, they called them. And they had gangs, and they would actually go and they'd have these fights, and it was so foreign. And at that point he was starting to wear leather and other things. He was still practicing his piano and taking piano lessons, but at a point he started putting his fists into a beaker of vinegar, because he had heard that it would help toughen up his skin, so that if he got into a fight, his skin would be tougher on his fist. And so it was about that time that we started to separate as far as spending time together. And it was probably very soon after that Ed Sullivan Show where he committed his life to being a rock and roll singer. And as we saw Billy going down this different path than we were, it seemed like Billy was the least likely person in our neighborhood to succeed, because he was dropping out of high school. And he ultimately dropped out of high school. He was with these gangs, and he was just running around a bit wild. And so it didn't seem like he was on a good path. there were periods of time where his mother had some, and she was his only parent at that point, where she had some psychological difficulties, and that made it, his life situation even more difficult. At the same time, he was also starting to put together a band. And I think the very first band he put together were called the Hassles. And I think that was somewhat indicative of the gang culture that he was involved with, that he would call the band the Hassles. And they had some moderate success on Long Island as a local band, started playing clubs, and they did have success and started to get a following at that point. I lost, while I was in college in upstate New York, I had lost contact with Billy, and he was on his own, doing things that were different, but he was primarily a local phenomenon. And I remember one time I was driving to the North Shore of Long Island, and I hadn't seen Billy in a few years, and I was driving up in a town called Cold Spring Harbor. And I was just driving up the road, and I looked to my left, and sitting out there on the porch was Billy Joel. And so I stopped, and we talked, and we had a great talk. And this was right after the first album had been produced, and it was an album called Cold Spring Harbor. And the album had been produced and recorded, but somehow or another it had been recorded at a somewhat slower speed than it actually had been played at. And so the sound came out a bit different than the actual, if you will, Billy Joel and playing the piano and such. But Billy and I reconnected in our early 20s, and I would occasionally go to see him in local clubs around Long Island and in New York City. And I remember I would go to this bar in New York City, and he would be playing, and the place would have tables, not, it wasn't a concert type venue, and it would just be tables and people drinking and a bar, and he had married by that time, and his wife was his manager. So he was having this local success on Long Island and into New York. And it was during those periods of time that I believe he became the piano man, because it was a number of years that he was playing that bar scene. And if you listen to the words of the Piano Man, you hear the story of playing those little venues, people coming up to him. I mean, between sets, I would sit and talk with him, and we would just, kind of hang out. And it was so informal, very intimate, and really pleasurable.